Tuesday, 15th November 2016, 11:40 p.m. At the junction of Shields Road and Scotland Street in Glasgow, a black Audi RS4 came to a stop at a red light. Inside sat a 26-year-old father of two. Moments later, another car pulled up alongside. What happened next would set off one of Scotland's most determined murder investigations in years, and a single, senseless mistake would help bring the killer down. Years earlier, 20 miles away in Paisley, a long-running feud over control and reputation had already left its mark. Shootings, trials, and lives lost. What began as a dispute on local streets would grow into one of Scotland's most violent rivalries. Two events years apart, connected by the same current running through the country's underworld. This is the story of the Paisley drug war and the Glasgow execution that followed, and how both revealed the scale of Scotland's organised crime. Welcome to UK Crime Documentaries. Let's get straight into the case. In the mid-1990s, Fergusley Park in Paisley was already known to police as one of Scotland's toughest housing schemes. Decades of deprivation had left the area vulnerable to the rise of small-time enforcers who quickly grew into organised networks. At the centre of it all stood two rival factions, one led by Stewart Boyd, known as Specky, the other by the Rennie family. What began as a territorial dispute over street corners and local debt collections soon evolved into a power struggle for control of the region's drug trade. Boyd's crew operated with a level of organisation rarely seen outside Glasgow at the time. Among his closest allies were Stuart Gillespie, George Docherty, and Robert Pickett, names that would later appear repeatedly in courtrooms and police briefings. They ran their business quietly, using front companies and intimidation to keep control. Across town, the Rennie brothers were building their own reputation. Mark, Barry, and their associates controlled other supply routes through Paisley, refusing to be muscled out. In the autumn of 1995, their rivalry turned violent. On a November night that year, the Rennie brothers were ambushed outside their home. A shotgun was fired at close range, an attack prosecutors would later describe as an attempted execution. The brothers survived, but it marked a turning point. Detectives quickly linked the incident to Boyd's crew, though local residents said few were willing to speak. The silence wasn't fear of the police, it was fear of what would happen afterwards. The violence spread beyond the streets. Boyd had set up FCB Security, a private firm that held council contracts to patrol housing estates and construction sites. On paper, it looked legitimate. But police and local officials began to suspect it was being used to funnel money and information back into Boyd's network. When the company eventually collapsed, it owed the council more than £300,000. By early 1996, the situation in Fergusley Park had become untenable. Witnesses were being threatened, statements retracted, and jurors warned off. For the first time, Scottish authorities created a dedicated witness protection unit, a move driven directly by the violence surrounding Boyd's gang and their feud with the Rennies. It was a sign of how serious things had become. One small neighbourhood had forced the justice system to change the way it worked. The stage was set. The next move would push the conflict beyond control. On the evening of the 23rd of May 1996, the feud that had gripped Paisley reached its breaking point. 26-year-old Mark Rennie was cycling along Stock Street near his home when a car pulled up behind him. Witnesses recalled hearing two sharp cracks, then seeing him collapse onto the road. He had been shot in the back at close range. The killers didn't wait to see if he survived. The car sped away, leaving Rennie fatally wounded. The murder was the culmination of months of rising tension between the Rennie brothers and Stuart Specky Boyd's crew. Just 6 months earlier, Mark and his brothers Barry and Brian had survived a shotgun ambush outside their home, which we have already discussed. In the months after Mark Rennie's murder, detectives turned their focus to the man they believed had orchestrated the violence, Stuart Specky Boyd. His name had been whispered in connection with the Rennie attacks, the firearms used, and the network that kept Paisley's trade in cocaine and heroin running. But by the time charges were brought, Boyd was gone. He had fled Scotland, vanishing into Europe under a false name, and for several years remained out of reach of the courts. When he finally returned, he faced trial on charges of conspiracy to murder, accused of directing the feud that had left one man dead and others scarred for life. The case drew national attention. An alleged gang leader brought home to answer for a wave of bloodshed that had forced police to change how they handled organized crime. Yet when the verdict came, the results stunned many in law enforcement. After weeks of evidence, the jury found Boyd not guilty. The prosecution had relied heavily on witnesses who later admitted they had been threatened or had refused to testify altogether. The system had cracked under the same fear that Boyd's network had built its power on. With the charges behind him, Boyd quietly expanded his reach. He was seen in Spain, traveling between the Costa del Sol and Glasgow, where a new generation of dealers looked to him for supply lines. According to court documents from later cases, he was involved in laundering and protection operations linked to expatriate Scottish criminals. His lieutenants continued to operate at home. Robert Pickett and George Docherty were both convicted for the 1995 shotgun attack on the Rennie brothers, which we have already covered, and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. Their imprisonment left a gap that Boyd filled by building connections outside Scotland. Firearms began moving north from England, part of a growing network that blurred the line between local disputes and national trafficking routes. But we will talk about this in a few minutes. By the turn of the millennium, the Paisley feud had grown into something bigger than turf. It had become an ecosystem, one that stretched from council estates to the Spanish coast and from car parks in Paisley to train stations on the English border. Boyd's acquittal hadn't ended the story. It had allowed it to evolve. The men who had once fought over a few streets now held keys to a cross-border trade that would soon draw in new faces, new weapons, and another wave of blood. By the early 2000s, detectives tracing the remnants of the Paisley feud began to notice a change. The shootings hadn't stopped, but the weapons had. The locally sourced sawn-offs and converted handguns that once fueled gang rivalries were being replaced by military-grade firearms, often with serial numbers filed away and parts imported from abroad. What had started as a neighborhood dispute had evolved into a professional network with access to continental suppliers. The most striking example came in 2012, when a covert investigation uncovered a plan to move a cache of weapons north to Scotland. Among them was an Uzi submachine gun, high-capacity pistols, and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. The link back to Paisley and Glasgow's organised circles was direct. The network behind the shipment included individuals long known to police for their association with figures from the Boyd and Gillespie era. The breakthrough came when Dempsey left 2 camouflage bags at Carlisle Station. Cleaners notified BTP, who opened the bags and found the weapons. The chain led to Barry Kelly and Craig Colquhoun, both from Paisley, and to serving British soldier William Dempsey, based in England. Dempsey had used his access to military-issue weapons and contacts to source components and ammunition for the gang. Another man, James Ashdown, later pleaded guilty to related offences. At Liverpool Crown Court in 2013, the plot was laid bare. Kelly and Colquhoun were found guilty of conspiracy to transfer prohibited weapons, and Dempsey admitted his role in the pipeline. The court heard how the group had intended to move the firearms north for sale or used by Scottish crime groups. Investigators told the court that several of those networks could be traced to individuals connected with Stewart Boyd's original organisation. The operation revealed the new reality of Scotland's Underworld. Its guns were no longer homemade or repurposed. They were imported, catalogued, and moved with the efficiency of a supply chain. It also showed how former foot soldiers from the 1990s had shifted into logistics, managing weapons, transport, and communication across borders. For Police Scotland and the National Crime Agency, the Carlisle seizure was a warning. The violence of Fergusley Park had gone quiet, but the infrastructure it built was still alive and operating in shadows, linking soldiers, couriers, and ex-gang members in a network that stretched from barracks to backstreets. It was a system that would, before long, circle back to Paisley once again. By October 2012, the old Paisley feud had faded from headlines, but the men who had built it were still active in Scotland's criminal underworld. One of them was Stewart Gillespie. After serving most of his life sentence, Gillespie had been released on license, living quietly in a flat in Gallow Hill, Paisley. On paper, he was out of the game, but old rivalries and debts have a way of surviving longer than the people who owe them. In the early hours of 25th October 2012, police were called to a disturbance at a top-floor flat in Glenburn Road. Inside, they found Gillespie with multiple stab wounds. Despite efforts from paramedics, he died at the scene. The man responsible, Norman Carlton, was arrested nearby after a brief search. Detectives later told the court that the attack had been ferocious and deliberate, a knife-driven assault that continued even after Gillespie had fallen. At the High Court in Glasgow, prosecutors described Carlton as a man with his own history of violence. He had previously served time for culpable homicide in a separate killing from 2001. This time, the charge was murder. The trial revealed that the confrontation inside the flat had escalated quickly, though the motive remained unclear: personal dispute, drug debt, or lingering connection to Paisley's criminal network. Whatever the cause, the verdict was decisive. Carlton was found guilty of murder and of attempting to kill another man, Robert Lawther, who had been present during the attack. The judge imposed a minimum term of 22 years. For those who remembered the 1990s, Gillespie's death was more than another statistic. It marked the symbolic end of the old Fergusley Park generation. George "Goofy" Doherty had already been shot dead in a gang attack years earlier. He was knifed in the street and then run over several times by the same vehicle in a brutal act of retribution believed to be linked to Glasgow's long-running gang conflicts between the Daniel and Lyons crime families. I will cover this whole rivalry in a separate and detailed video, as there is lots of material to discuss. According to reports referencing prison and police sources, James Jasper McCann, an associate of the Daniel faction, was at one point suspected in connection with Doherty's killing. However, despite extensive inquiry, no one was ever convicted of the murder. The case remains officially unsolved. Robert "Piggy" Pickett was serving a long prison sentence for his part in the earlier feud. He was shot and seriously injured in a 2006 gang attack that also claimed the life of Michael Lyons, 21, during the same violence between Lyons and Daniel crime families. Pickett later became directly involved in a series of murder bid conspiracies between 2016 and 2017, targeting rivals including Stephen "Bonzo" Daniel, a senior member of the Daniel faction. In May 2018, he was sentenced to 16 years imprisonment alongside 5 associates for those offences. While in custody, Pickett continued to exert influence. Reports from HMP Kilmarnock described him as effectively running the jail with his son-in-law, Christopher Kavanagh, who acted as his enforcer. Kavanagh, 30, later admitted stabbing Robert Forbes in Paisley in 2017, an attack prosecutors said was carried out after Forbes approached police with information about Pickett. Kavanagh took the blame in a plea deal, which saw the case against Pickett dropped. By the time of these later convictions, Pickett had become closely linked to the Lyons gang, marking a shift from his earlier Paisley roots to Glasgow's wider underworld. His reputation inside prison was one of control and intimidation, a man whose authority stemmed from decades of surviving Scotland's most volatile criminal networks. And Stuart Boyd, the man whose name had once dominated Paisley, had died in a car crash on Spain's Costa del Sol in 2003, when his vehicle collided with another, killing 6 people. The old guard was gone, but the culture they created endured. In Paisley, the same streets where the Boyd and Rennie crews once clashed still carried the weight of their history. Younger groups, influenced by the legends of the 1990s, filled the vacuum, smaller, more secretive, and harder to track. Police Scotland's local units continued to run operations targeting drugs and firearms, but the community scars were lasting. Fergusley Park, once the epicenter of a turf war, became a case study for how a few years of unchecked violence could define a town for decades. Stewart Gillespie's murder closed a chapter, not with peace, but with exhaustion. The players were gone, yet the machinery of the underworld they helped build was still moving, setting the stage for a new generation of organized crime that would reach far beyond Paisley. The Paisley feud may have ended, but its echoes didn't. By 2016, that same current of violence had shifted to Glasgow and claimed its next target. November 15th, 2016. Glasgow's Kinning Park district, a quiet, industrial stretch linking the south side to the river. At 11:40 p.m, the rain was just beginning to fall. At the junction of Shields Road and Scotland Street, a black Audi RS4 rolled to a stop at the red light. Behind the wheel sat Ewan E.J. Johnston, to the police, an alleged figure in the city's organised crime scene. At first glance, it looked like a routine end to a night out. Johnston had just finished a late meal at the Red Pepper, a small Italian restaurant on St Andrews Road, where he'd eaten with a friend, Brian McMahon, 31. CCTV from the restaurant shows them entering at 10:46 p.m, relaxed and unhurried. Johnston was known to some in Glasgow's underworld as part of a small but active circle, operating between Pollokshields and Maryhill, moving drugs and money for others higher up the chain. What Johnston didn't know was that even as he ordered his food, another car, a dark Audi Q5, had already begun circling the area. The same vehicle would appear minutes later on multiple security cameras. At 11:30 p.m, it was seen driving slowly past the restaurant twice before pulling into McCulloch Street, a short road that gave a clear view of the Red Pepper's front window and the car Johnston had arrived in. Inside, the Q5 were men intent on surveillance, tracking his movements, timing his routine, preparing for what was to follow. Two men exited the car, walking past Johnston's Audi RS4 before returning. One was seen wearing a dark Nike high-tech windrunner jacket, its distinctive reflective zip later becoming the crucial piece of evidence in the case. When Johnston and McMahon eventually left the restaurant around 11:38 p.m, they climbed into the RS4. CCTV then captured the Q5 moving almost simultaneously, its headlights appearing behind Johnston's car as both vehicles turned towards Shields Road. At 11:40 p.m, Johnston stopped at the red light at Scotland Street. He was on the phone to his partner, Danielle Carruthers, telling her he'd be home soon. Within moments, 3 shots would ring out, and a night that began with dinner would end with an execution. 2 bullets struck Johnston directly in the head, one passing clean through his skull and brain, causing what forensic examiners later described as an unsurvivable injury. The third round embedded itself in the rubber seal of the driver's door, centimeters from McMahon. The gunman's aim had been deliberate, professional, and final. The impact of the first shot threw Johnston sideways. His foot, still pressed on the accelerator, jammed down hard. The RS4 lurched forward with full power before veering violently across the junction. It mounted the curb and crashed into roadside barriers, crumpling against a metal railing near the entrance to Shields Road Underground Station. McMahon, dazed and unhurt, scrambled to reach his friend, but Johnston was motionless, slumped over the steering wheel, blood pooling on the seat. At 11:41 p.m, the emergency call went out. Witnesses nearby reported a car speeding off north towards the Kingston Bridge, its lights off, disappearing into the night. Police and paramedics arrived within minutes. Johnston was pulled from the wreck and rushed to Queen Elizabeth University Hospital. Despite attempts to resuscitate him, doctors confirmed what was already clear from the scene. He had suffered a catastrophic brain injury. At 2:50 a.m. on the 16th of November 2016, Ewan Johnston was pronounced dead. In the hours following the shooting, Glasgow's roads were sealed off in every direction. Officers from the Major Investigations team began tracing CCTV feeds from every junction between Kinning Park and the city's north side. By dawn, detectives had identified a pattern linked to Audi Q5 with the help of CCTV. Just after sunrise, the search turned up a crucial discovery. In Possil, several miles north of the murder scene, firefighters were called to a burning Audi Q5, abandoned on waste ground. By the time officers arrived, the car was completely engulfed. It had been torched deliberately. The next stage was slow, methodical, and forensic. What fire hadn't consumed was sifted, catalogued, and examined by experts from the Scottish Police Authority Forensic Service. Inside the blackened shell, investigators found two things that would eventually break the case. The first was a spent bullet casing, identical in caliber and pattern to those recovered from Shields Road. The ballistic link tied the burnt vehicle directly to the shooting. The second find was smaller, fragments of a Nike high-tech zipped top, partially melted and fused into the passenger side debris. The charred material was sent for analysis. Forensic scientist Morag Coyle later told the High Court that she examined the zip area and recovered a viable DNA sample. The result came back as a match to David Scott, 33, of Glasgow. It was the first solid connection between the gunman and the crime scene, a mistake the killers hadn't accounted for. Investigators then overlaid the forensic evidence with CCTV footage. The timeline that emerged was precise. What we have already covered of Q5 activity. Piece by piece, the case was coming together and formed a chain of evidence strong enough to put a name to the execution. And soon, a face. When detectives finally moved in on David Scott, the operation was planned with the same methodical care that had characterized the investigation. Officers from Police Scotland's Major Investigation team coordinated an early morning raid on a flat in Glasgow's East End. Armed units surrounded the property, blocking escape routes. He was arrested on suspicion of murder, cautioned, and led away for questioning. The same day, forensic officers began searching the property, recovering clothing and electronic devices for further analysis. Detectives later confirmed that several items matched patterns seen on CCTV. When the case finally reached the High Court in Glasgow, it carried all the weight of a gangland execution and the evidence to match. At the centre stood David Scott, 33, from Glasgow, accused of the murder of Ewan E.J. Johnston on the 15th of November 2016. Alongside him in the dock was Anthony Ruthven, also 33, alleged to have acted with others unknown in the attack. Both men denied the charges. The prosecution, led by Advocate Deputy Alex Prentice KC, called it a well-planned execution. Prosecution presented all the overwhelming evidence. At the time of his murder, Johnston himself had been awaiting trial at the High Court on charges of dealing £640,000 worth of heroin, a case that tied him to organised criminal groups operating between Glasgow and Paisley. Prosecutors argued that his death was connected to the same Underworld disputes. The jury returned a unanimous guilty verdict against David Scott, but before discussing his conviction, let's discuss what even happened worse after his conviction. David Scott remained a violent and volatile presence within Scotland's prison system. By December 2019, while serving his life term, Scott was already back in the headlines. Inside HMP Perth, he launched a brutal assault on Paul Lyons, a member of the notorious Lyons crime family, the same network we talked about in the first case. The attack took place in the prison's visiting area, in full view of families and staff. CCTV captured Scott sprinting across the room, pulling a makeshift blade from his waistband and slashing Lyons repeatedly around the head and neck. Lyons was left with a wound close to his carotid artery and required emergency medical treatment. The attack wasn't an isolated outburst. Just weeks earlier, Scott had carried out another violent assault inside HMP Edinburgh, targeting inmate Dale Thomas with a combination of a knife strike and a boiling water and sugar mixture. a napalm-style attack intended to scar and blind. Thomas lost part of his ear and suffered severe burns. Prosecutors later revealed Scott's motivation for both incidents. He believed that Lyons and Thomas bore ill will towards him because of his role in Johnston's killing. His defense described the assaults as preemptive, claiming Scott feared being targeted himself. In total, he pleaded guilty to 3 charges of serious assault, including one on a prison officer during a later altercation. In October 2025, Police Scotland announced a renewed search linked to the case, this time far from Glasgow. Acting on fresh intelligence, specialist officers began excavating a grass embankment near Soroba Road, Oban, roughly 90 miles northwest of the city. Detectives believed that a firearm connected to Johnston's killing could be buried there, hidden after the attack. The operation involved forensic teams, divers, and national resources combing the site over several days. It followed years of unresolved leads and the long-held suspicion that more than one person had been present during the shooting. Police once again appealed for information, stressing that loyalties may have shifted over the 9 years since the attack. Potential witnesses were urged to come forward with the assurance that anonymity could be protected. The renewed search symbolized more than an evidence hunt. It was a statement that, even nearly a decade later, Scotland's justice system had not forgotten. Johnston's murder had exposed the brutal efficiency of the city's underworld. Scott's conviction had brought partial closure. But as long as others who played a role remained unidentified, the investigation stayed open and unfinished. When the verdict was read in May 2018, Lady Stacey handed down a life sentence, ordering that David Scott, 33, will serve a minimum of 22 years before even being considered for parole. The man accused alongside him, Anthony Ruthven, was formally cleared of all charges after the prosecution withdrew the case mid-trial. The Crown acknowledged that no forensic evidence, CCTV footage or witness testimony tied him to the shooting. Ruthven walked free, leaving open the same question that had haunted investigators from the start. Who were the others unknown mentioned in the indictment? For David's vicious assaults on Dale Thomas and Paul Lyons and the attack on a prison officer in 2020, he was handed an additional 8-year term in 2021. It meant he would likely spend most of his life in custody. What do you think about the cases and the sentences? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your take. And if you found this breakdown informative, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode of UK Crime Documentaries.